Sometimes the choices we make in a single moment can change everything we thought we knew about ourselves. For Jonas Cutter, that moment came on an autumn evening in the Cedar Ridge mountains when a woman's desperate scream shattered his solitude. A boy had stopped breathing down by the creek. Jonas ran without thinking, driven by something deeper than reason. He worked over that child using old knowledge most folks had forgotten, refusing to quit even when hope seemed lost. When the boy's eyes finally opened, the people watching called it a miracle. But what Jonas didn't know was that saving one life would uncover a truth buried in these mountains for 30 years. A truth about why he'd really come here. A truth that would test everything he believed about second chances before we jump back in. Tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in the high country carried the scent of pine and coming winter. Jonas Cutter stood on the porch of his cabin, coffee steaming in his calloused hands, watching the sun break over the eastern peaks. 12 years he'd been here, 12 years since he'd climbed these mountains seeking something he couldn't name. Peace, maybe, or punishment. Some days he still wasn't sure which one he'd found. The cabin sat on a natural shelf of land halfway up the ridge, protected by towering ponderosa pines on 3 sides and open to the valley below on the 4th. He'd built it himself, log by log, in those first desperate months when physical exhaustion was the only thing that let him sleep. The structure was solid, tight against the weather, with a stone fireplace that drew clean and a roof that had weathered a dozen hard winters without complaint. It wasn't much, but it was his. Above the door hung a small wooden cross, hand-carved on his first night here when the darkness had felt like it might swallow him whole. He'd worked by firelight, knife moving almost of its own accord, shaping the simple symbol from a piece of pine. He wasn't a religious man, hadn't been even before everything fell apart. But that night, he'd needed something to hold on to. The cross had stayed there ever since, weathered grey by sun and storm. A reminder of the man who'd arrived here broken, and the vow he'd made to never bring harm to another soul again. His days followed a rhythm as reliable as the seasons. Rise before dawn, tend the animals, 3 chickens, a milk cow named Bess, and an old mule called Stubborn who lived up to his name. Chop wood, haul water from the spring, hunt when the stores ran low. In summer he kept a garden that produced more than he needed, and he'd learned to preserve and store against the lean months. In winter he trapped, mostly for the pelts that he could trade down in Cedar Ridge settlement for the few things he couldn't make or grow himself. The settlement lay 3 miles below, visible from his porch as a scattering of wooden buildings clustered around a single dirt road. He'd been there maybe 24 times in 12 years, always for supplies, never staying longer than necessary. The people were polite enough, if cautious. They called him the hermit on the ridge when they thought he couldn't hear, and he supposed that was accurate. He kept to himself, answered questions with as few words as possible, and made it clear he preferred his own company. But alone didn't mean lonely. At least that's what he told himself on the long winter nights when the wind howled through the pines and the cabin felt too quiet. He had his work, his land, his animals. He had the mountains, ancient and indifferent, asking nothing of him but respect. He had the sky, vast enough to make his troubles feel small. Most days, that was enough. This morning he planned to work on the cabin expansion he'd started back in spring. The original structure was 12 by 16 feet, suitable for a man alone, but he'd decided to add another room, maybe 12 by 12. He wasn't sure why he needed the extra space. Habit, maybe, or the simple satisfaction of building something. His hands knew tools the way some men knew prayer. And there was peace in the work. The lumber was stacked and seasoned, cut from trees on his own land and milled by hand with a ripsaw that had cost him 2 prime beaver pelts and a week's worth of venison. The foundation stones were set, level and solid. He'd framed the walls already, and now it was time for the roof beams. Heavy work, the kind that would leave his muscles aching in that good way that promised deep sleep. He set down his coffee cup and moved to the worksite. His tools were laid out with military precision, a habit from another life that he couldn't shake even when he wanted to. Hammer, saw, level, square, plane, all of them well-maintained and sharp. He believed in respecting his tools. They were honest things that did exactly what they were made for, no more and no less. The first beam was already cut to length, a beautiful piece of pine without a knot or check in it. He'd saved it special for this, knowing it would bear the load of the entire roof corner. He wrestled it into position, balanced it on the temporary supports, and began marking where the mortise joints would go. The work required concentration, precision. A mistake here would weaken the entire structure. The sun climbed higher, warming his back as he worked. Sweat soaked through his flannel shirt, despite the autumn chill. He fell into the rhythm of it, the ancient dance of measure twice, cut once, fit and adjust and fit again, until the joint slipped together like it had always meant to be that way. This was meditation for him, this making of things that would outlast him, that would stand long after he was dust. Around midday, he paused for water and a piece of dried venison. Standing in the shade and looking out over the valley, from up here, he could see the ribbon of the creek that ran through the settlement. The small fields where people tried to coax crops from the rocky soil, the thread of trail that wound up into the higher mountains where the old mining claims sat abandoned and slowly returning to wilderness. Cedar Ridge had been a gold rush town once. 40 years ago, before Jonas was even born, men had poured into these mountains chasing dreams of wealth, tearing into the earth with picks and dynamite and desperate hope. Most had found nothing. A few had struck color, built their little empires, then watched the veins play out and the dreams die. The ones who stayed were the stubborn ones, the ones who'd put down roots too deep to pull up easy, who'd learned to scratch out livings from timber and livestock and the hard, simple work of just surviving. Jonas understood them, even if he kept his distance. They were refugees, too, in their own way. Running toward something or away from it, it didn't much matter in the end. The mountains didn't care about your reasons. They'd either kill you or make you strong enough to live here, and that was the only judgment that counted. He went back to work, setting the second beam. The sun wheeled across the sky, marking time in the movement of shadows. His hands moved with sure confidence, driving pegs, checking angles, making adjustments so small only he would ever notice them. But he'd notice, and that mattered. If you couldn't take pride in doing a thing right, what was the point of doing it at all? The afternoon stretched long and golden, that particular quality of autumn light that made everything look like it was remembering summer. The aspens down in the valley were turning, splashes of yellow and gold, against the evergreen. Soon the first snow would come, locking him in for the winter months. He needed to finish this roof before then, get it shingled and sealed against the weather. He was lining up the third beam, hammer raised for the first blow, when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the mountain silence. A woman's voice, high and sharp with terror, carrying up through the pines from somewhere down near the creek trail. He's not breathing. Someone help! He's not breathing. Jonas froze, hammer still raised, every muscle suddenly tense. For a heartbeat he didn't move, didn't breathe, caught between the present moment and a flood of memories he'd spent 12 years trying to drown. Then the woman screamed again, and his body moved before his mind could catch up. He dropped the hammer and ran. His boots pounded down the slope. Pine needles slick under his feet, branches whipping at his face. The path was barely a deer trail, steep and treacherous, but Jonas knew every root and stone from 12 years of walking it. His heart hammered against his ribs, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, it wasn't from exertion alone. The woman's voice came again, closer now, ragged with panic. "Please, somebody." Jonas burst through a stand of young fir and saw her. She stood in the middle of the creek trail, maybe 30 yards down from where it crossed the water. A woman in a brown dress, dark hair coming loose from its pins, her face white as birch bark. She saw him and her hand flew out, pointing, "Down there! By the water!" "He's just a boy." Jonas didn't waste breath on questions. He ran past her, boots splashing through the shallow ford, and saw the small crowd gathered on the far bank. Three children huddled together, faces streaked with tears. A man in a dusty coat, traveling merchant by the look of him, stood helpless, hands opening and closing like he wanted to do something but didn't know what. An older rancher Jonas recognized from the settlement stood back, hat in his hands, already wearing the look of someone at a death watch. On the ground between them lay a boy, maybe 10 years old, thin as a rail fence, lips blue-tinged and wrong. His eyes were half open but seeing nothing. His chest didn't move. Jonas dropped to his knees beside the child, fingers going to the boy's throat. No pulse he could find, though his own blood roared so loud in his ears he couldn't trust it. The boy's skin was cool, but not cold. Minutes, then. Maybe just minutes. What happened? Jonas's voice came out steady, years of command training kicking in without permission. The woman had followed him, was kneeling on the boy's other side, her hands hovering over the child like she wanted to touch him, but was afraid to. We were walking back from the upper meadow. The children wanted to see the aspen colors. Thomas, his name is Thomas, he said his leg hurt and then he just fell down and stopped breathing. Jonas looked at the boy's leg. The trousers were torn at the calf, and underneath he could see 2 small punctures, already swelling, the skin around them an angry red. "Snake bite," he said. "Rattler, most likely. This late in the season they're sluggish but still dangerous." The merchant made a strangled sound. "Then he's done for. I seen a man die from rattler bite once. Nothing to be done." "Shut up." Jonas didn't look at him. His mind was racing, pulling up memories he'd tried to bury. Years ago, before the army, before everything went wrong, he'd spent a summer with an old trapper named William Stokes. Bill had traveled with the Shoshone for a time, learned their ways with healing and medicine. He'd shared some of that knowledge with Jonas during those long evenings by the campfire. "You know healing." The woman's voice was desperate, clinging to the hope in his tone. "Some old ways can't promise anything. Please." Her hand clutched his arm. "Please try. He's like my own." Jonas met her eyes for half a second. Brown eyes, deep with pain and fear and something else he couldn't name. Then he turned back to the boy. First, the venom. It would be spreading through the small body, heading for the heart. He needed to slow that down. Jonas pulled his knife from his belt, a keen-edged blade he kept sharp enough to shave with. The woman gasped but didn't stop him. He made a small cut across each puncture mark, just deep enough to bleed. The rancher made a noise of protest, but Jonas ignored him. He put his mouth to the wound and sucked hard, then spat. The taste was bitter wrong. He did it again and again, spitting blood and venom onto the ground beside him. "Jesus and Mary," the merchant whispered. Jonas pulled back, wiped his mouth. Need to get his heart moving, his breathing. He positioned his hands on the boy's chest, remembering what Bill had taught him. The Shoshone had a technique, pressing on the chest in rhythm, forcing the heart to remember its work. White doctors called it something else now, Jonas had heard, but the principle was the same. He began pressing, counting under his breath, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After 30 compressions, he tilted the boy's head back, pinched his nose, and breathed into his mouth. The boy's chest rose with the air Jonas forced into it, then fell. "What in God's name?" the rancher started. "He's trying to save him." The woman's voice was fierce. "Let him work!" Jonas repeated the sequence. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. His own breath came hard, sweat running down his face despite the autumn cool. The boy remained still, absent, hovering in that space between life and whatever came after. The woman began to pray, words spilling out soft and desperate. The children cried quietly. The merchant shifted his weight, uncomfortable. The rancher replaced his hat, looked away. Jonas kept working. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. His arms burned, his lungs ached. The boy's skin remained that terrible blue-white color. But Jonas couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Not while there was any chance at all. Another memory rose, unbidden. Men under his command, dying in the desert heat, crying out for water and mothers and God. Jonas kneeling beside them, helpless, watching life drain away into the sand, unable to save them, unable to do anything but bear witness to his own failure. Not this time. Not this boy. He pressed harder, breathed deeper. Sweat dripped from his face onto the boy's still chest. The woman's prayers became a steady murmur, almost a song. Time stretched strange, seconds becoming hours, the world narrowing. To just this, his hands, the boy's chest, the rhythm of compression and breath. Then so faint he almost missed it, a flutter under his fingers, a pulse, weak as a newborn kitten's, but there. Come on, Jonas whispered. Come on, son. Your people need you here. He gave 2 more breaths, and this time, the boy's chest rose on its own. A small movement, but not from Jonas's air. The boy's own breath, shallow and uncertain, but real. Jonas sat back on his heels, hands shaking. The boy coughed, a weak sound, and his eyes flickered. He drew another breath, this one deeper. Color began to creep back into his lips, replacing that terrible blue. Thomas! The woman sobbed his name, reaching for him but stopping herself, afraid to touch him like he might break. Oh, Thomas, sweet boy. The boy's eyes opened wider. He looked confused, frightened. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Don't try to talk yet, Jonas said, his voice rough. You just rest easy. You've had a close call, but you're going to be all right. The woman was crying now, not trying to hide it. She looked at Jonas with something like awe. You brought him back. He was gone, and you brought him back. The merchant crossed himself. Never seen anything like it. It's a miracle, plain and simple. Not a miracle. Jonas pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. Just old knowledge. Medicine from folks who understood how the body works. But the rancher was shaking his head, his weathered face transformed with something close to reverence. Call it what you like, son, but we all saw that boy dead, and now he's breathing. That's miracle enough for anyone. The children crept closer, reaching out to touch Thomas, reassuring themselves he was real and alive. The boy managed a weak smile for them. The woman, Jonas realized he didn't even know her name, kept one hand on the boy's shoulder like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. We need to get him to town, Jonas said. To Dr. Pierce. That venom's still in him, and he'll need watching for a day or 2. I'll ride ahead, the rancher said, already moving toward his horse, tied further up the trail. Get the dock ready. The merchant helped Jonas fashion a travois from branches and the man's coat. They settled Thomas onto it as gently as they could. The boy winced, but didn't cry out. Tough kid, Jonas thought. Mountain-born tough. The woman walked beside the travois as Jonas and the merchant carried it. The other children followed behind. Quiet now. Their tears dried, but their faces still pale with shock. I'm Clara, the woman said after a while. Clara Hensley. I teach the children in Cedar Ridge. Thomas is one of my students. Jonas Cutter. I know who you are, Mr. Cutter, the hermit on the ridge. She said it without judgment, just fact. Thank you. Thank you for not being too far away. Thank you for knowing what to do. Thank you for... Her voice broke. He's all his parents have, their only child. They lost 2 others before Thomas was born. If he died... He didn't die, Jonas said firmly. He's going to be fine. They walked on in silence for a while, the only sounds their breathing and the soft drag of the travois over the trail. The sun was lower now, painting everything in that rich golden light that comes just before evening. Birds called in the pines, oblivious to the small drama that had played out below them. As they neared the settlement, Jonas could see people gathering. The rancher had spread the word, and folks were coming out to see. Jonas felt his chest tighten. This was exactly what he'd avoided for 12 years. Attention, questions, the press of other people's gratitude and curiosity. But there was no help for it now. The boy needed the doctor, and Jonas had made his choice when he'd run down that mountain instead of staying safe in his solitude. They carried Thomas to the doctor's house, a neat cabin with a shingle hanging out front. Dr. Samuel Pierce, a man in his 60s with intelligent eyes and gentle hands, took one look at the boy and started barking orders. Within minutes, Thomas, was on a bed, being examined with professional competence. Jonas tried to slip away in the confusion, but Clara caught his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong for such a slender woman. "Mr. Cutter, please, don't go yet." He stopped, uncomfortable with the weight of her gaze. Up close he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 35, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of smiling and squinting into the sun. Her brown eyes held depths he didn't want to explore. "The boy's in good hands now," Jonas said. "Dr. Pierce knows his business." "I know, but I—" She paused, seeming to search for words. "You saved him, Mr. Cutter. You saved Thomas when the rest of us were just standing there helpless. I need you to understand what that means. To me, to his family, to all of us. I did what anyone would do?" "No." She shook her head firmly. "You did what almost no one could do. You had knowledge and skill, and you didn't hesitate. You didn't worry about propriety or what people might think. You just acted." Jonas shifted his weight, wanting to be anywhere but here, pinned by her gratitude and the curious stares of the growing crowd outside the doctor's house. "I should get back. Got work waiting." "Of course," but she didn't let go of his arm yet. "Mr. Cutter, Jonas, I don't know how to thank you properly, but I want you to know that you didn't just save Thomas today. You saved me too." There was something in the way she said it, a weight of meaning that went beyond the simple words. Jonas met her eyes and saw grief there, old and deep, and a kind of desperate relief that made his throat tight. "Ma'am," he managed, then pulled gently free and walked away before she could say anything else. The crowd parted for him as he left, people murmuring their thanks and amazement. He heard the word miracle more than once. Someone touched his shoulder as he passed. Someone else called out a blessing. Jonas kept his head down and his pace steady until he was clear of the settlement and back on the trail leading up to his cabin. Only when he was alone in the trees did he stop and let himself shake. His hands trembled, his breath came short, and for a moment the world spun around him. He touched life today, held it in his hands and fought for it and won. After 12 years of believing he had no right to anyone's life, not even his own, the sun was setting as he climbed back to his cabin. The abandoned beam still lay where he'd left it, the hammer on the ground beside it. His coffee cup sat on the porch rail, cold now, forgotten. Everything exactly as it had been just hours ago, but nothing the same at all. Jonas picked up the hammer and looked at it for a long moment. Then he went inside, found the tin box he kept under the loose floorboard, and took out the tarnished military medal he'd buried there 12 years ago. He held it in his palm, feeling its familiar weight, and for the first time since he'd climbed these mountains, he didn't feel like the weight might crush him. That night, sleep came easier than it had in years. 3 days passed before Jonas saw another soul. 3 days of working on the cabin, trying to fall back into the comfortable rhythm of solitude, finding that the rhythm no longer quite fit. His hands knew the motions, measure, cut, fit, secure, but his mind kept wandering down the mountain to the settlement, wondering how the boy was healing, whether the venom had left any lasting damage. If Clara Hensley had returned to teaching her students, he told himself it didn't matter. The boy was alive, in good hands, and Jonas had done what needed doing. That should be the end of it. He should be able to return to his life the way it was, the careful isolation he'd built so deliberately. But on the 4th day, they came. Jonas was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard horses on the trail. He set down the axe and walked around front, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. 2 riders approached, a man and woman on a sturdy bay, leading a pack mule loaded with goods. The man dismounted first, middle-aged and weather-worn, with the calloused hands of someone who worked the land. The woman followed, younger, with the same dark hair as Mr. Cutter. The man approached, hat in his hands. "Name's Robert Brennan. This is my wife, Margaret. We're Thomas's parents." Jonas nodded, suddenly awkward. "How's the boy?" "Alive, thanks to you." Margaret Brennan's voice broke on the words. "Dr. Pierce says another few minutes and we'd have lost him. The venom would have reached his heart. He's a strong boy." "Did well, Mr. Cutter." Robert stepped closer, his weathered face working with emotion. "We don't have much. We're farmers, and this land doesn't give up its bounty easy. But we wanted to bring you something. To show our gratitude, he gestured to the mule. Jonas saw sacks of flour and cornmeal, jars of preserved vegetables, smoked meat wrapped in cloth, and what looked like a new wool blanket. That's not necessary, Jonas started, but Margaret cut him off. Please, let us do this. You have to understand. Her voice trembled. Thomas is our only living child. We lost 2 before him. Sarah, stillborn. Michael, taken by fever when he was just 3 years old. When Thomas came, healthy and strong, we thought we'd finally been blessed. And then when he stopped breathing, when I thought we were going to lose him too, she couldn't continue. Robert put his arm around her shoulders. What my wife means to say, Robert continued quietly, is that Thomas is everything to us. Our whole world. And you gave him back to us. There's no gift that equals that. But please, let us offer what we can. Jonas looked at them, saw the naked gratitude and pain in their faces, and knew refusing would hurt them more than accepting. I appreciate it. Thank you. They helped him unload the mule, carrying the supplies into his cabin. Margaret's eyes widened slightly when she saw the sparse interior, the single room, the narrow bed, the few pieces of handmade furniture, the conspicuous absence of personal effects. But she said nothing, just helped arrange the foodstuffs on his shelves. Thomas wanted to come, Robert said as they worked. Been asking every day if he's well enough to ride up here. Doctor says maybe another week. He doesn't need to do that. He wants to thank you himself. And, Robert hesitated, he's been talking about you constantly. About what you did, how you knew exactly what to do. He thinks you're some kind of hero. Jonas felt his chest tighten. I'm not. To him you are. To all of us. Margaret touched his arm gently. I know you keep to yourself, Mr. Cutter. The whole settlement knows that, and we respect it. But I hope you might make an exception for Thomas. He's a good boy, curious and eager to learn. And right now, you're all he talks about. They left shortly after, heading back down the mountain with promises to return with Thomas when he was stronger. Jonas stood on his porch watching them go, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed isolation developing cracks he hadn't invited. 2 days later, Clara Hensley came. Jonas was working on the roof beams when he heard her approach. Not on horseback this time, but on foot, moving quietly up the trail with the confidence of someone who knew the mountains. He watched her come, wiping sawdust from his hands, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't want to examine. She wore a simple dress of dark blue, practical for walking, and carried a canvas satchel over one shoulder. Her hair was pinned up properly today, not wild like it had been on the creek trail, and her face had color in it instead of that. Terrible white pallor of fear, Miss Hensley. He climbed down from the ladder. Mr. Cutter, I hope I'm not disturbing your work. Just taking a break anyway. A lie, but a small one. How's the boy? Thomas is doing wonderfully. Dr. Pierce says he's never seen anyone recover so quickly from a rattler bite. He thinks it's because you got the venom out so fast. She smiled. Thomas says it's because you have magic hands, Jonas snorted. Not magic. Just remembered some old lessons from the trapper you mentioned. When he looked surprised, she added, You said something about old medicine when you were working on Thomas. It stayed with me. I've been curious about it. Man named William Stokes. I knew him when I was younger. He'd lived with the Shoshone for a time, learned their healing ways. He taught me some things during a summer we spent trapping together. That's a remarkable skill to have. Most people wouldn't remember such lessons well enough to use them in a crisis. Jonas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Seemed important at the time. Clara set down her satchel and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. I brought you something. It's not much, but everyone's bringing me things. It's not necessary, I know, but I wanted to. She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a loaf of bread, still warm, and a small jar of honey. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage bread. And the honey is from my own hives. I keep 3 boxes behind the schoolhouse. The smell of fresh bread made Jonas's stomach clench with sudden hunger. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had anything but his own rough cooking. Thank you. That's kind. May I sit? She gestured to the porch steps. Jonas hesitated, then nodded. They sat together in the morning sun, and Clara broke off a piece of bread, drizzled honey on it, and handed it to him. The taste was extraordinary, sweet and rich and warm, the kind of simple pleasure he'd forgotten existed. "I wanted to talk to you," Clara said after a moment. "About Thomas and about what you did. But also," she paused, seeming to search for words, "also about what you said." "About me," Jonas went still. "I don't recall saying much. You said I didn't need to thank you. But I disagreed. I told you that you'd saved me too, not just Thomas." She looked at him directly, her brown eyes clear and serious. "I meant that, Mr. Cutter, and I think you knew I meant it. I figured you were just overwrought." "Understandable, given the circumstances. I was overwrought. But I wasn't exaggerating." She took a breath. "My husband died 3 years ago. Mining accident up at the Silverbell claim. We'd only been married 5 years. I was destroyed. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't imagine going on." Jonas said nothing, just listened. He recognized the sound of old grief in her voice, knew it as well as his own reflection. "The children saved me," Clara continued. "Having to teach them, being responsible for their learning and their safety, it gave me a reason to keep moving. Thomas especially, he was so eager, so full of questions and life. He reminded me why the world was worth staying in, even when it hurt so much I could barely breathe." She fell silent for a moment, staring out at the mountains. A hawk wheeled overhead, hunting the updrafts. When I saw him lying there, not breathing, I felt everything I'd built crumbling. All that careful healing, all that hard-won peace, just gone. And I thought, this is it. This is the blow that finally breaks me completely. She looked at Jonas again. "But then you came, and you didn't give up even when it looked hopeless. You just kept fighting for him, and when he opened his eyes—" Her voice broke. She wiped at her eyes impatiently. "When he opened his eyes, I realized I'd been given a second chance. Not just Thomas, but me. A chance to keep going, to keep teaching, to keep finding reasons to be glad I'm alive." She reached out and touched his hand briefly. "That's what you gave me, Mr. Cutter. That's why I said you saved me too." Jonas looked down at his own hand, feeling where hers had touched it. "I understand loss, Miss Hensley. I know what it's like to think you can't keep going. And I'm glad the boy made it. For his sake and yours. What brought you to these mountains, Mr. Cutter, if you don't mind my asking?" He did mind, but found himself answering anyway. "I was in the cavalry. Commanded a unit out of Fort Robinson. We were sent after a band of Sioux who'd left their reservation. It was—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "You don't have to tell me," Clara said softly. "We caught up with them near the border. I made a decision, a tactical decision, that I thought was right. But I was wrong, and good men died because of it. Men under my command, men who trusted me." He stared out at the mountains, seeing something else entirely. "I couldn't stay in the service after that. Couldn't look at another soldier without seeing the faces of the ones I'd gotten killed. So I came here. Figured if I couldn't be trusted with other people's lives, I should remove myself from other people. But you saved Thomas. That was different." "How?" Jonas didn't have an answer for that. They sat in silence for a while, the sun warming the wooden steps, the breeze carrying the scent of pine and coming winter. Finally Clara stood, brushing off her skirt. "I should get back. I left the children with Mrs. Patterson, and she'll be wanting her own lunch soon." She picked up her satchel, then paused. "Mr. Cutter, Jonas, we're having a small gathering this Sunday. Just the settlement folk, sharing a meal after the church service. Nothing fancy, but I'd like it very much if you'd come. I'm not much for gatherings, I know, but I'm asking anyway." She smiled at him, and it transformed her face, made her look younger and lighter. "Thomas will be there. He'd be so happy to see you. I'll think about it. That's all I ask." She started down the trail, then turned back. "Thank you for the conversation, Jonas, and for the honesty. It means more than you know." He watched her disappear into the trees, then sat alone on his porch for a long time, the taste of honey still sweet on his tongue, wondering what he'd just allowed to begin. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm Jonas hadn't expected. Thomas came every Saturday, arriving mid-morning with a lunch his mother had packed and eyes bright with eagerness to learn. Jonas started him with the basics: how to hold a saw properly, how to read the grain of wood, how to use a plane to shave a board smooth. The boy was careful and attentive, soaking up knowledge like dry earth soaks rain. Clara visited twice more, bringing bread or preserves, staying to talk on the porch while the autumn sun wheeled across the sky. She told him about her students, about the challenges of teaching 8 children of different ages, all in one room, about her struggles with loneliness and her small victories over grief. Jonas found himself sharing more than he'd intended. Not everything, not the worst of what he carried, but enough that she began to understand the shape of his isolation. He went down to the settlement twice more for Sunday gatherings. The people grew less cautious around him, more welcoming. Sheriff Garrett asked his opinion on a dispute between 2 ranchers over water rights, and Jonas was surprised to find his old officer's training useful in seeing both sides clearly. Dr. Pierce wanted to hear more about the Shoshone healing techniques, taking notes while Jonas explained what he remembered from old Bill Stokes's teachings. The cabin roof was finished before the first snow, tight and weatherproof. Jonas built a small table for the new room, then a bookshelf, though he had few books to put on it. The space felt less like expansion now, more like preparation for something he couldn't quite name. But the tracks kept appearing. Not every day, but often enough that Jonas knew it wasn't his imagination. Someone was watching, circling his property, always keeping to the tree line. He never saw who it was, and the few times he tried to follow. The tracks, they disappeared into rocky ground that held no sign. It was on a cold morning in late October when things began to change. Jonas was in his barn, checking supplies, when he found the old surveyor's map tucked behind some loose boards. The paper was water-stained and brittle with age, but the lines were still clear. Property boundaries, creek beds, mineral claims from the gold rush days. He carried it into the light, studying it more carefully. Most of the names meant nothing to him: defunct mining operations, long-abandoned homesteads. But then he saw it. In the careful script of whoever had drawn this map, Cutter's claim, marked near a remote canyon about 5 miles northeast of his cabin. Jonas stared at the name, his own surname, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd never researched the history of this land when he'd bought it from the bank 12 years ago. He just wanted isolation, distance, a place to disappear. The fact that it was called Cutter's Ridge had seemed like meaningless coincidence, but what if it wasn't? He took the map down to Cedar Ridge that afternoon, found Sheriff Garrett in his small office. The sheriff studied the map with interest, tracing the boundaries with a weathered finger. "This is old," Garrett said. 40, 50 years at least, from the first rush when people were staking claims all over these mountains." He tapped the mark showing Cutter's claim. "You think this might be family?" "I don't know. I was orphaned young, never knew much about where my people came from. But the name could be coincidence." Garrett looked up at him. "But you don't think it is?" "I don't know what I think. Is there anywhere I could find records? Old documents about who owned what? Settlement keeps some archives." "Not much, and it's mostly a mess, but Clara Hensley's been trying to organize it. Teaching project with the older students," she said, "learning about local history." Garrett rolled up the map carefully. "She might be able to help you look." Jonas found Clara in the schoolhouse, working at her desk while the afternoon light slanted through the windows. She looked up when he entered, and her face brightened in a way that made his chest feel tight. "Jonas, this is a surprise." Then she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" He showed her the map, explained about the name. Clara studied it with growing interest, then stood decisively. "Come with me. The archive is in the church basement. It's a disaster, but if there are any records about that claim, they'd be there." They spent the rest of the afternoon and into the evening digging through boxes of old documents, deed records, claim registrations, letters and journals from the early settlers. The paper smelled of age and mouse droppings, and the candlelight made reading difficult, but Clara was methodical and patient. It was Clara who found the first real evidence, a deed registration from 1854 for Daniel Cutter, filing a gold claim in the northeastern canyon region. Jonas took the paper with shaking hands, staring at the name. Daniel Cutter, his grandfather's name. "Keep looking," Clara said quietly. "There might be more." There was more, a lot more. Daniel Cutter had been one of Cedar Ridge's founding settlers. The record showed he'd owned significant land, participated in community decisions, been respected and active in the settlement. There were mentions of his wife Emma and of a son born in 1855. A son named Jonas, Clara read from a faded letter. Jonas Jr., born April 3rd, 1855. Jonas felt the room spin slightly. His name, his grandfather's name. This wasn't coincidence. What happened to them? He asked. Why don't people remember? Clara kept searching, her movements growing more urgent. She found it near the bottom of a box. A sheriff's report from November 1856. Daniel Cutter had been reported missing, his claim abandoned. His wife and infant son had left the settlement shortly after, destination unknown. "There's a note here," Clara said, reading carefully. "Says Daniel was investigating suspicious activity in the canyons. Thought someone was using the remote areas to hide stolen goods. He planned to report to the territorial marshal, but..." She looked up at Jonas. "He disappeared before he could." "They killed him," Jonas said flatly. "Whoever he was investigating, we don't know that for certain." "Yes, we do." Jonas stood, paced the small space of the basement. "That's why Emma left. She was frightened for herself and the baby. She had to run." "Jonas, even if that's true, it was 70 years ago. Whatever happened then, it's long past." "Is it?" He turned to face her. "Someone's been watching my property. I've seen tracks for weeks now. And now I find out my family used to own this land, that my grandfather disappeared under suspicious circumstances." "You think that's coincidence?" Clara's face went pale. "You think someone knows about the connection? They think someone's interested in that canyon, and they don't like that I'm living on land that gives me access to it." Jonas ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I need to see that place. Need to understand what Daniel was investigating. Then I'm coming with you." "Clara..." "No." She stood, chin set stubbornly. "If you're right, if there's something dangerous happening, you need someone to know where you are. Someone to get help if you don't come back. And besides," her voice softened, "I've spent 3 years hiding from life, Jonas. Teaching those children brought me back, but it wasn't enough. Not really. This helping you, finding out the truth about your family, this feels important, real. I'm not staying behind." Jonas looked at her, saw the determination in her eyes, the way her hands were clenched at her sides. He recognized that stubborn courage, had seen it in the men he'd commanded, the ones who'd followed him even when they were afraid. "All right," he said finally, "but we tell the sheriff first. If something goes wrong, someone needs to know where to look." They found Garrett at the saloon, having a quiet drink after his rounds. When Jonas explained what they'd found and what he planned to do, the sheriff's expression grew grave. "If there is something going on up in those canyons, it's my job to investigate it, not yours. With respect, Sheriff. You've got a whole settlement to watch over, and whoever's out there, they're interested in me specifically. Let me see what I can find. If there's trouble, I'll report back to you." Garrett studied him for a long moment. "You've got military experience. I've heard the talk. Cavalry officer, 10th Regiment, 5 years of service. And you left because I made a mistake that got good men killed." Jonas met the sheriff's eyes steadily. "I understand if that makes you think I'm not trustworthy. But I give you my word, I'm not looking for a fight. Just answers. No, what it makes me think is that you understand the cost of mistakes, that you won't take unnecessary risks." Garrett finished his drink. "All right, you go look. But you take supplies for 2 days, no more. If you're not back by sunset the day after tomorrow, I'm coming looking with every able man in this settlement. Understood?" "Understood. Thank you, Sheriff." Outside the night was cold and clear, stars sharp overhead. Clara walked with Jonas back toward the edge of the settlement. "I'm frightened," she admitted quietly, "but also excited, I think." "Is that strange?" "No, it means you're alive. Means you're willing to take risks for something that matters." She looked at him in the starlight. "You matter, Jonas. Your family's story matters. Finding the truth matters. I want you to know that." Jonas didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. They stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable between them, before Clara turned back toward her small house near the school. Jonas walked up the mountain alone, his mind churning with questions. Daniel Cutter, Emma, the baby who'd been named after his grandfather. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they made was troubling. When he reached his cabin, he noticed the tracks again. Fresh ones, from earlier today while he'd been down in the settlement. Someone had come close to his cabin, walked around it, then retreated back into the trees. Jonas loaded his rifle and set it beside his bed. Tomorrow he and Clara would ride for the canyon. Tomorrow he'd start looking for answers. But tonight he'd keep watch, and he'd be ready if whoever was leaving those tracks decided to do more than just observe. The wind picked up, whistling through the pines, and Jonas sat by his window watching the darkness until the stars began to fade and dawn touched the eastern peaks with gold. The settlement gathered in the church that evening, every able-bodied adult crowding into the pews to hear what Jonas and Sheriff Garrett had to say. Tension hung thick in the air. People had heard rumors all day about the hermit's discovery, about danger in the mountains, about Thomas Brennan's uncle and dark family secrets. Robert and Margaret Brennan sat in the front row, their faces ashen. Thomas was with Clara in the schoolhouse, kept safe and away from what was about to unfold. The boy had done a brave thing, reporting what he'd overheard, but he didn't need to hear the full truth about his family. Not yet. Jonas stood at the front of the church, Daniel Cutter's journal in his hands. The bullet hole through its center drew every eye. Sheriff Garrett stood beside him, his badge catching the lamplight. "Most of you know I came to Cedar Ridge 12 years ago," Jonas began. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. "What you don't know is why this place. Why this mountain? I thought it was random chance. Turns out it wasn't." He held up the journal. "This belonged to Daniel Cutter, my grandfather. He lived here 70 years ago, owned the land I live on now. He was one of your founders. A good man, by all accounts, respected, honest." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People leaned forward, listening intently. In the summer of 1856, Daniel discovered a criminal operation using the remote canyons to hide stolen gold. He planned to report it to the territorial marshal. Jonas opened the journal to the last page, his voice roughening. But before he could, he was murdered. His wife and infant son, my father, had to flee for their lives. They changed their name, hid their connection to this place, and tried to forget. He set the journal down gently on the pulpit. "Today, Clara Hensley and I found his remains. Found proof of what happened. And we found something else, evidence that the same gang is still operating. Still using those canyons. Still hiding contraband?" The murmurs grew louder, more agitated. Sheriff Garrett raised his hand for quiet. "Now here's the hard part," Garrett said. "The gang that killed Daniel Cutter was called the Brennan Gang. And we have reason to believe that Marcus Brennan, brother to Robert here, is involved in the current operation." The church erupted. People shouting questions, demanding answers, some standing in anger. Robert Brennan sat frozen, his face drained of all color. Margaret had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Please!" Garrett shouted over the noise. "Let me finish." The crowd settled reluctantly. Every eye was on the Brennans now, a mixture of shock, anger, and pity. Robert and Margaret knew nothing about this. Garrett continued firmly. "They are innocent. Their son Thomas is innocent. But Marcus Brennan has been using his family connection to the settlement as cover for his criminal activities. He's been watching Jonas, worried that the hermit on Cutter's Ridge might discover what his gang has been hiding in those canyons for generations." Robert Brennan stood, his voice breaking. "I haven't seen my brother in 15 years. He left when Thomas was born, Said he was going to work in the silver mines in Nevada. I had no idea, we had no idea. He turned to face Jonas, his face ravaged with grief and shame. My family killed yours. My blood is responsible for your grandfather's death. No, Jonas stepped forward. Your ancestors' choices are not your burden to carry. I know something about trying to carry guilt that doesn't belong to you. Believe me when I say, you and Margaret and Thomas are not responsible for what Marcus has done or what your family did 70 years ago. The words felt strange in Jonas's mouth, even as he spoke them. He was telling Robert Brennan what he himself was only beginning to believe, that a man could be separate from his family's sins, that the past didn't have to define the present. Clara stood from where she'd been sitting near the back. The question now is what we do about it. Marcus knows we found the canyon. He knows we have Daniel's journal. He's not going to just walk away. Agreed, Garrett said. Which is why I'm deputizing every able man here. We're going to raid that canyon, arrest Marcus and anyone working with him, and end this once and for all. You don't understand what you're up against, a new voice said from the back of the church. Everyone turned. An older man stood in the doorway, someone Jonas didn't recognize. He was maybe 70, weathered and bent with age, but his eyes were sharp and clear. Name's William Garrett, the old man said, walking slowly down the aisle. The sheriff's father. I used to wear the badge in this town, back in the 50s and 60s. I know things about the Brennan gang that most folks have forgotten. Sheriff Garrett looked surprised. Pa, you haven't talked about those days in years, because it was safer not to. Because some truths are dangerous. The old man reached the front of the church, looked at Jonas. I knew your grandfather, knew Daniel Cutter. He was a good man, brave man. And he died because he underestimated the Brennans. What do you mean? Jonas asked. The gang wasn't just some petty thieves. They were organized, well-armed, and connected to bigger criminal operations across the territories. When Daniel tried to expose them, they didn't just kill him. They made sure no one would ever dare cross them again. They burned out 3 families who'd been friendly with Daniel, ran the territorial marshal out of town when he came investigating. This settlement survived because people learned to look the other way. The church had gone deadly quiet. Jonas felt cold spread through his chest. How many, he asked. How many men does Marcus have? When I was sheriff, there were maybe a dozen core members. Could be more now, could be less. But they're professional criminals, son. Not farmers with hunting rifles. You go up against them unprepared. You'll end up just like your grandfather. So what do you suggest? Garrett asked his father. We just let them keep operating? No. I'm saying you need help, real help, federal. Marshals, territorial rangers, men trained for this kind of fight. The old man looked around at the gathered townspeople. These are good people, honest people, but they're not soldiers. I am, Jonas said quietly. Everyone looked at him. I was a cavalry officer. 5 years of service. I know how to plan. An operation. How to train men. How to fight when fighting's necessary. And I was there when you saved my boy, Robert Brennan said, standing again. You didn't hesitate, didn't think about yourself. You just acted. If you're willing to lead us, I'm willing to follow. My brother's crimes are not mine, but ending them, that's my responsibility now. Others stood, voices calling out agreement. Ranchers, farmers, the blacksmith, the general store owner, men who'd never fired a shot in anger, but were willing to learn, willing to fight for their home. Jonas looked at them, felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders again. The same weight that had crushed him 12 years ago when his decisions got good men killed. His hands started to shake. Then Clara was beside him, her hand on his arm, steadying him. You're not the same man you were, she said softly, for his ears alone. You've learned. You've grown. You can do this. Jonas looked into her eyes, saw faith there that he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. He thought of Daniel Cutter, writing that final letter to a son he'd never see grow up. Thought of Thomas, bright-eyed and innocent, carrying the weight of a family legacy he hadn't chosen. Thought of all the years he'd spent hiding on that mountain, believing he had no right to anyone's life. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe he had changed, or maybe it was time to stop running from the man he used to be and figure out how to be the man he needed to become. "All right," Jonas said, his voice carrying across the church. "Here's what we're going to do." He laid out the plan, using his military training, thinking tactically for the first time in 12 years. They'd need reconnaissance first, to understand how many men Marcus had and how well armed they were. They'd need to train the volunteers in basic formations and tactics. They'd need to send for federal help, but that would take time. Weeks, maybe months. In the meantime, they'd set up defensive positions around the settlement, establish watch rotations, make sure no one was ever alone or vulnerable. Marcus would likely try to strike before they could organize properly. They needed to be ready. As Jonas spoke, he watched the people's faces change from fear to determination. They were scared, yes, but they were also angry. Tired of being threatened, tired of looking the other way, tired of letting the Brennan gang operate with impunity in their mountains. Old William Garrett listened carefully, nodding occasionally. When Jonas finished, the old man spoke up. "That's sound planning, son. Your grandfather would be proud. But there's one more thing you need to know." He paused, looking around the church. "The Brennans have always had inside information. Someone in Cedar Ridge has been feeding them intelligence for years. Someone here, in this room, right now." The silence was absolute. People looked at each other with sudden suspicion and fear. "Who?" Sheriff Garrett demanded. "Pa, if you know who the informant is, I don't know for certain, that's the hell of it. But I know one exists. How else would Marcus have known Jonas was at the canyon today? How else would he always seem one step ahead?" The old man's gaze swept the crowd. "One of you has been betraying this town, and until we know who, we can't trust anyone completely." Jonas felt the fragile unity he'd been building start to crack. Doubt crept in, suspicion, fear. This was how the Brennans had kept power for so long, not just through violence, but through division, through making people afraid to trust each other. "Then we'll have to be smart," Jonas said firmly. "We share information on a need-to-know basis. Critical details stay with a small group, and we watch each other's backs, because divided, the Brennans win. Together, we have a chance." The meeting broke up slowly, people leaving in small groups, talking in low voices. Jonas noticed how they clustered with those they knew best, trusted most. The informant's existence had poisoned the well, exactly as intended. Clara stayed behind with Jonas and the Garretts. "What now?" she asked. "Now we prepare," Jonas said. "And we wait for Marcus to make his move, because he will. He can't afford to let us organize." Robert Brennan approached them, Margaret at his side. "I want to help," Robert said. "Whatever you need. My brother's crimes, I can't undo them, but I can stand against them." "I know you can," Jonas said, "and I'm glad to have you." After everyone had gone, Jonas stood alone in the empty church, Daniel's journal still on the pulpit. He picked it up, felt the weight of it, the bullet hole that had ended his grandfather's life. Daniel had stood alone against the gang and paid the ultimate price. Jonas wouldn't make that same mistake. He'd build an army, such as it was, of farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers. He'd train them, prepare them, and when the time came, he'd lead them. But this time, he'd do it right. This time no one would die because of his decisions. He wouldn't allow it. Outside, the night was cold and clear. Jonas walked back toward his cabin, his mind already working on strategies and contingencies, while Clara walked beside him in companionable silence. Halfway up the mountain, she spoke. "You're carrying your grandfather's watch." Jonas touched his pocket, feeling the stop timepiece there. "Thought I should. Reminder of what's at stake. Be careful it doesn't become a burden instead of an inspiration." Wise words. I'm a school teacher. Wise words are part of the job. She smiled, but it faded quickly. "Jonas, I'm frightened. For you, for Thomas, for all of us. Fear's natural. Means you understand the danger. When this is over." She stopped, started again. If we survive this, I'd like us to... Jonas stopped walking, turned to face her in the starlight. I know, I want that too. But let's not make promises about the future until we're sure we have one. She nodded, and they continued walking. Jonas left her at the edge of the settlement and climbed the rest of the way alone, his rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of watchers. The tracks were there again when he reached his cabin. Fresh ones. Someone had been here tonight while he was at the church, while the settlement was distracted. Jonas followed them to the edge of his property, saw where they led off into the deep forest. A message was carved into a tree where the tracks ended. You should have stayed on your mountain, hermit. Jonas stared at the words for a long moment, then turned back to his cabin. He loaded both his rifles, checked his pistol, and settled in to wait. The war had started, whether he was ready or not, and this time he'd make sure he finished it. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Jonas organized the men of Cedar Ridge into 3 groups based on their skills and limitations. The first group, younger men with hunting experience, he trained in basic marksmanship and small unit tactics. They'd be the primary fighting force if it came to that. The second group consisted of older men and those less mobile, assigned to defensive positions around the settlement itself. The third group was support, runners, medical assistants, supply management. Clara turned the schoolhouse into a headquarters of sorts, keeping careful records of supplies, weapons, and the watch rotation schedule. She worked with the women to prepare medical kits, to stockpile food and water, to plan evacuation routes if the worst happened. Thomas helped her, proud to be useful, still unaware that his uncle was the source of the danger they faced. Jonas trained the men hard but fairly, drawing on his cavalry experience but adapting it to the reality of who they were, civilians defending their homes, not professional soldiers. He taught them to move quietly through the forest, to communicate with hand signals, to set up overlapping fields of fire. Most importantly, he taught them when not to fight, how to recognize when retreat was the smarter option. Sheriff Garrett proved to be a solid second-in-command. He knew the people, knew the land, and had a calm authority that kept panic at bay. His father, old William Garrett, shared intelligence from his years as sheriff, the locations of possible hideouts, the routes the gang favored, the tactics they'd used in the past. But the waiting wore on everyone's nerves. Marcus Brennan and his gang made no move, sent no further messages. The tracks around Jonas's cabin stopped appearing. It was like they'd vanished into the mountains, and the uncertainty was almost worse than direct confrontation. On the 10th day of preparation, a stranger rode into Cedar Ridge. He was young, maybe 25, with the hard look of someone who'd lived rough. He wore dual pistols and had a repeating rifle in his saddle scabbard. People stepped aside as he rode down the main street, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Sheriff Garrett met him in front of the general store. "Help you with something, friend?" "Looking for a man named Jonas Cutter. Heard he might be around these parts?" Jonas stepped out from the hardware store where he'd been checking ammunition supplies. "I'm Cutter." The stranger studied him with cold gray eyes. "Got a message for you. From Marcus Brennan. I'm listening. He says you made a mistake digging up the past. Says people who make mistakes in his territory don't live long enough to regret them." The stranger's hand moved toward his pistol. "Says I should demonstrate what happens to people who cross the Brennan gang." Jonas's own hand was already on his weapon, years of training making the movement instinctive. "Before you do something you can't take back, understand that you're surrounded by armed men who won't let you leave here alive if you draw that weapon. Is Marcus paying you enough to die for him?" The stranger paused, his eyes flicking to the windows where rifle barrels had appeared, to the rooftops where men had taken position. He hadn't noticed them gathering, but they were there, ready. His hand moved away from his pistol slowly. "Smart choice," Garrett said. "Now ride out of here and tell Marcus that Cedar Ridge isn't frightened anymore. We're done looking the other way." The stranger's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Your funeral." He wheeled his horse and rode out fast, disappearing up the mountain trail. "That was a test," Jonas said. seeing how organized we are, how we'd respond to a direct threat, and we showed them we're ready. Garrett looked around at the armed townspeople. But it also means they'll hit us soon. They know they can't wait us out now. That night, Jonas called a meeting of his core leadership, Garrett, old William, Robert Brennan, Dr. Pierce, and Clara. They gathered in the church basement, away from curious eyes. We can't just sit here waiting for them to come to us, Jonas said. We need to force their hand, draw them into a fight on our terms, not theirs. How? Robert asked. We don't even know exactly where they are. We know they're using the canyon. That's their base of operations, where they store whatever contraband they're moving. Jonas spread out the old surveyor's map on the table. What if we make them think we're planning to raid it? Make it obvious, even sloppy. Let the informant report back to Marcus. Clara understood immediately. You want to bait a trap. Make them think we're vulnerable. Exactly. Marcus will want to hit us before we can hit him. If we give him an obvious opportunity, he'll take it. You're talking about using yourself as bait, Clara said, her voice tight with worry. You're the one they want dead most, which is why it'll work. I'll make a show of preparing to raid the canyon, taking men, supplies, moving, obviously. Marcus will either hit me on the trail or wait until I'm away and attack the settlement. Jonas looked around the table. Either way, we'll be ready. Old William studied the map thoughtfully. It could work, but you need to be prepared for both possibilities. If they hit you on the trail, you need enough real strength to survive. If they hit the settlement, the people you leave behind need to be able to hold. I've been thinking about that. Jonas pointed to a narrow section of the trail leading to the canyon. Here, natural choke point. If Marcus hits us on the trail, we can fall back to this position and make a stand. Rocky terrain, good cover, limited approaches. We'd have the advantage. And if they hit the settlement? Dr. Pierce asked. We fortify the church and schoolhouse. Move the women and children there. Put our strongest defenders in position. Make it costly for them to attack. Jonas looked at Robert. Your brother knows this settlement. He'll know the weak points. We need you to think like him. Help us cover those vulnerabilities. Robert's face was pained, but he nodded. I can do that. He's always been strategic, even as a boy. He'll look for the easiest target, the path of least resistance. They spent the next 3 hours planning every detail, contingency upon contingency. Who would go with Jonas? Who would stay behind? Supply caches, fallback positions, signals for communication, medical protocols, evacuation plans. By the time they finished, Jonas felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, but this time it felt different. This time, he wasn't alone with the burden. The next morning, Jonas made a show of gathering his raiding party. 12 men, all mounted, carrying supplies, obviously meant for several days in the field. He announced their intention loudly in the general store, where half the settlement could hear. They were going to clear out the canyon, arrest anyone they found there, and reclaim the land for legitimate use. Clara pulled him aside before he left, her face pale but composed. Be careful. Please, always. He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her what she'd come to mean to him, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he handed her a sealed letter. If something happens to me, read this. Not before. She took it with shaking hands. Jonas, I'll be back. He mounted stubborn, checked his weapons one last time. Keep Thomas safe. Keep them all safe. You keep yourself safe. I've only just found you. I'm not ready to lose you yet. He looked at her, saw the depth of feeling in her eyes, and felt something in his chest crack open. When this is over, he said, we're going to have that conversation we keep not having. About the future. About what we want. Deal? Deal. She stepped back, blinking away tears. Now go. And come back. The raiding party rode out with the sun at their backs, moving up into the high country. Jonas set a steady pace. Not too fast, but steady, making sure they were visible to any watchers. His men were tense but ready, their nervousness balanced by determination. They knew the risk, knew they might be riding into an ambush, but they also knew they were fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom from fear. 3 hours into the ride, Jonas called a halt at a spring to water the horses. While the men rested, he pulled Sheriff Garrett aside. They're following us. 3 riders, maybe 4, staying just out of sight. Scouts or the advance guard. Marcus will know our strength now, know our route. Question is whether he hits us before we reach the canyon or waits until we're committed. What's your instinct? Jonas thought about it, about what he knew of criminal tactics, about human nature. He'll hit us at the choke point. It's the obvious place for an ambush, which means he'll think we're expecting it there and might hesitate. But he's arrogant, used to winning. He'll think he can overwhelm us, even in a defensive position. And if you're wrong, then the settlement's in danger, and Clara and the others will have to hold. Jonas checked his rifle. But I don't think I'm wrong. Marcus wants me dead personally. This is about pride now, about finishing what his ancestors started with Daniel Cutter. They mounted up and continued riding. The trail climbed higher, the air growing thinner and colder. Afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountainside. Jonas felt the familiar pre-battle tension, the hyper-awareness of every sound and movement. His men felt it too. Conversations died away, replaced by watchful silence. The choke point appeared ahead, a narrow defile between 2 rocky ridges, barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast. Perfect ambush country. Jonas signaled a halt. This is it, he said quietly. Garrett, take 4 men and scout ahead. If it's clear, signal. If not, fall back here quickly. The rest of you, prepare defensive positions. I want rifles covering every approach. The men moved with surprising efficiency, the training of the past 2 weeks paying off. Within minutes, they had cover established, fields of fire overlapping, fallback routes marked. Jonas positioned himself where he could see the entire kill zone, his Henry rifle loaded and ready. Garrett and his scouts disappeared into the defile. 5 minutes passed, 10. Jonas felt sweat on his palms despite the cold. Something was wrong. The scouts should have signaled by now. Then he heard it, a single gunshot echoing off the canyon walls, followed immediately by a storm of rifle fire. Ambush! Jonas shouted. Hold positions. Wait for my command. Men poured out of the defile on horseback, firing as they came. Not just 3 or 4 scouts, but at least 20 armed riders. Marcus had brought his entire gang, and Jonas's small force was about to be overwhelmed. Fall back! Jonas called, firing as he retreated. Controlled retreat to secondary position. His men followed the plan, moving in pairs, one covering while the other retreated. It was chaos, but controlled chaos, and they made the gang pay for every yard of ground. Jonas saw Garrett and 2 of his scouts make it back, but the other 2 were down, bodies left behind in the defile. Good men, dead because of Jonas's decisions. The old guilt threatened to swallow him, but he forced it down. Not now, grieve later, fight now. They reached the secondary position, a rocky outcropping with a clear view of the approach. The gang's advance slowed, cautious now, having learned the settlers could fight back. Jonas counted his men. 9 still standing, against at least 15 or 20 attackers. Bad odds, but not impossible. Make every shot count. He called, aim carefully, don't waste ammunition. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm, the gang advancing, the settlers firing, men falling on both sides. The sun dipped toward the western peaks, painting everything in shades of red and gold. Jonas moved among his men, encouraging, directing fire, trying to be everywhere at once. A figure appeared on horseback above the main body of attackers, a man Jonas instinctively knew was Marcus Brennan. He matched Robert in build and features, but where Robert's face showed kindness, Marcus's showed only cold calculation.
Cutter!
Marcus's voice carried across the battlefield. This doesn't have to end with everyone dead. Give me the journal and I'll let you and your men ride out. So you can keep terrorizing these people? Jonas shouted back. Not a chance! Your grandfather made the same mistake. Look where it got him. It got him a legacy worth dying for. What's yours worth, Brennan? Marcus's answer was a volley of gunfire that splintered rock all around Jonas's position. The message was clear. No more talking, only fighting until one side or the other was destroyed. Night was coming. Jonas had to make a decision. Stay here and possibly win, but lose more men, or try to break through back to the settlement. Either way, people he'd sworn to protect might die, just like 12 years ago. Just like the cavalry mission that had haunted him ever since. The difference was, this time, he wasn't alone with the burden. This time, good people had chosen to stand with him, knowing the risk, accepting it. Their courage gave him strength. "Here's what we're going to do," Jonas told his remaining men. "We're going to show these criminals what it means to fight for something that matters." And as the sun set on Cedar Ridge, the real battle began. Jonas's mind raced through options. The boulder provided cover from 3 directions, but left him exposed to the 4th. His ammunition was running low. Maybe 6 shots left in the rifle, another 6 in his pistol. Against 3 armed men who knew his position, the mathematics of survival didn't look good. But Jonas had learned something in 12 years of solitude, something he'd forgotten during his cavalry days. Patience. The ability to wait, to let the enemy make the mistake instead of forcing the action. He checked Daniel's pocket watch, the one he'd been carrying since finding his grandfather's remains. Still stopped at 3:47, the moment of Daniel's death. But Jonas's moment wasn't 3:47. His moment was now, and he was still breathing, still fighting, still refusing to quit. "Come out, Cutter," Marcus called. "Make it easy on yourself. I promise it'll be quick." Jonas remained silent. In the stillness, he heard what Marcus and his men didn't, hoofbeats in the distance, multiple riders coming fast. Either the settlement's reinforcements responding to his signal, or more gang members arriving. Jonas had to assume the worst and plan accordingly. He pulled Daniel's journal from his coat, looked at the bullet hole one more time. His grandfather had stood alone and died. But Jonas didn't have to stand alone. He had Clara waiting for him, had Thomas, learning to carve wood with careful young hands, had Sheriff Garrett and Robert Brennan, and a whole settlement of people who'd chosen to fight rather than surrender to fear. That was the difference between then and now. Daniel had fought alone because he'd had no choice. Jonas had a choice. He could die here defending a principle, or he could survive and live for something better. The hoofbeats grew louder. Jonas risked a glance around the boulder and saw riders entering the canyon. Sheriff Garrett leading a dozen men from the settlement. Not reinforcements for Marcus, but for Jonas. His signal had been seen and help had come. Marcus saw them too. His face twisted with rage and something else. Fear, maybe, or the realization that he'd finally lost. "Kill him!" he screamed at his remaining men. "Kill him now!" The 2 gang members rushed Jonas's position together, firing as they came. Jonas rolled left, came up shooting. The first man dropped, clutching his leg. The second got a shot off that burned across Jonas's shoulder, but Jonas's return fire was more accurate. The man went down and didn't move. That left Marcus, alone now, his gang destroyed or scattered. He stood in the center of the canyon, still holding his rifle, but the wild look in his eyes suggested he knew it was over. "It's done, Marcus," Jonas called out, standing slowly from cover. "Your men are dead or wounded. The settlement knows everything. There's no running from this. You've destroyed everything." Marcus's voice cracked with fury. 7 decades my family ran these mountains. 7 decades of doing as we pleased. And you come here with your self-righteous cavalry attitude and tear it all down. Your family murdered my grandfather, terrorized innocent people, ran a criminal operation that hurt this whole territory. Jonas walked slowly toward him, rifle ready but not aimed. It was always going to end, Marcus. The only question was, how many more people would suffer first? Like you're any better. I heard about you, Cutter. About the cavalry mission that went wrong, the men who died under your command. You're just as much a killer as I am. The words hit like physical blows. Jonas stopped walking, felt the old guilt rise up. "You're right," he said quietly. "I did get men killed, made bad decisions, tactical errors that cost lives. I've carried that weight for 12 years. So what makes you think you have the right to judge me? Because I learned from it." Jonas took another step forward. "I learned that running from responsibility doesn't ease guilt. I learned that the past shapes us but doesn't have to define us. And I learned that sometimes you get a second chance to do better, to be better. You had that same chance, Marcus. You could have walked away from your family's legacy, built something honest. Instead, you chose to continue the violence." Sheriff Garrett and his men had spread out around the canyon, rifles trained on Marcus. There was no escape, no way out. Marcus seemed to realize it too. His shoulders slumped, the rage draining away, leaving only a tired man facing the end of everything he'd known. "You going to kill me?" Marcus asked. "Finish what your grandfather started." Jonas thought about it, about how easy it would be to pull the trigger, to end the Brennan gang once and for all with a single bullet. About revenge and justice and all the reasons why Marcus deserved to die. Then he thought about Thomas, the innocent boy learning woodworking, carrying the Brennan name without the Brennan sins. About Clara, who taught him that the past didn't have to be prison. About Daniel Cutter's final words to his infant son. "I hope you have the courage to stand." Jonas lowered his rifle. "No, you're going to face trial, answer for your crimes legally. That's how justice works when you're not running from it." The 70-year-old bullet from Daniel's journal fell from Jonas's pocket as he moved, clinking against the canyon rock. Jonas picked it up, held it in the moonlight. A bullet that had taken one life, that had started a cycle of violence and fear that had lasted generations. He threw it as hard as he could into the darkness beyond the canyon, heard it clatter away into the rocks, lost forever. Some symbols didn't need to be kept. Some cycles needed to be broken, not continued. "Sheriff," Jonas said. "He's yours." Garrett moved forward with 2 of his men, disarming Marcus and binding his hands. The other gang members were secured or being tended by Dr. Pierce, who'd ridden with the reinforcements. The battle was over. Cedar Ridge was free. Jonas found himself shaking as the adrenaline drained away. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him, and exhaustion hit like a physical weight. Garrett caught his arm, steadying him. "You did good, son, real good. Your grandfather would be proud." Jonas looked around the canyon, at the place where Daniel had died, standing up for what was right. "I hope so. I really hope so." They rode back to Cedar Ridge as dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. A new day, in more ways than one. 3 months later, Jonas stood on his completed cabin porch, watching the first real snow of winter settle over the mountains. The new room was finished now, properly shingled and weatherproof, with a stove that kept it warm even on the coldest nights. But the cabin felt different than it had when he'd first started building it, less like a fortress against the world, more like a home that welcomed the world in. Marcus Brennan and the surviving gang members had been tried and convicted. The territorial judge had come all the way from Denver, drawn by the dramatic story of a 70-year-old crime finally brought to justice. Marcus was serving 20 years in the territorial prison. The others had received lesser sentences, except for 2 who'd chosen to cooperate with authorities and reveal the full extent of the gang's operations across 3 territories. The trials had revealed the informant too, an elderly shopkeeper named Harold Webb, who'd been feeding information to the Brennans for over 30 years out of fear and financial need. Jonas had felt more pity than anger for the old man, understanding how fear could trap someone into choices they never meant to make. Webb had been given a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony, and would spend his remaining years making what amends he could. Cedar Ridge itself had changed. The shadow that had hung over the settlement for generations was finally lifted. People walked easier, talked freer, made plans for the future without the constant underlying fear. Several new families had moved in, drawn by tales of the community that had stood together against criminal tyranny. The settlement was growing, thriving, becoming something more than just a desperate cluster of survivors. Thomas Brennan came up the trail now, trudging through the ankle-deep snow with the determined gait of youth. He carried his own set of woodworking tools, a gift from Jonas, carefully selected and properly maintained. The boy had real talent, patient hands, and an eye for grain and form that couldn't be taught. "Morning, Mr. Cutter," Thomas called, stamping snow off his boots on the porch steps. "Morning, Thomas. Ready to work on that chair?" "Yes, sir." "I've been practicing the joints you showed me. I think I've got them right now." They worked together in the new room, which Jonas had set up as a proper workshop. The boy had grown in confidence over the past months, had worked through the revelation about his uncle with the resilience of youth. Robert and Margaret had been honest with him, explaining the family history, making sure Thomas understood that he could choose his own path regardless of the choices his ancestors had made. "Mr. Cutter?" Thomas asked as he carefully fitted a mortise joint. "Can I ask you something?" "Always. People say you were a hero, that you saved the whole settlement. But you never talk about it. Why?" Jonas thought about how to answer that, how to explain the complicated truth to a 10-year-old boy. "Because what happened wasn't about being a hero, Thomas. It was about making a choice, about deciding whether to keep hiding from my past or face it. The settlement needed someone to stand up, and I happened to be in a position to do it. That's all. But you could have left. Could have just gone somewhere else and let it be someone else's problem. I could have. 12 years ago, that's exactly what I did. Ran from a problem instead of facing it. But running doesn't solve anything. It just means you carry the weight with you everywhere you go." Jonas helped the boy adjust the angle of his chisel. "What matters isn't whether you make mistakes, Thomas. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do after. Do you learn from them? Do you try to be better? Do you stand up when standing up is hard?" Thomas nodded seriously, absorbing this. "Is that why you stayed? After everything was done? Because you could have left then too. I stayed because this is home now. Because I've got people here who matter to me. Because running away doesn't actually take you anywhere worth being." The boy smiled at that, returning his attention to his woodwork. They worked in companionable silence for another hour before Thomas had to head back down to the settlement. Jonas walked him to the edge of the property, watched him disappear down the trail, and felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the workshop stove. Clara came in the afternoon, as she did most days now. She brought fresh bread and news from the settlement. The Hendersons had a new baby. The general store was expanding. Reverend Michaels was planning a special service for Christmas. She talked while Jonas made coffee, and he listened with the attention he'd give to important intelligence, because her life, her world, had become important to him. "I have something for you," she said after they'd settled on the porch, despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and watching the snow fall. She pulled out a wooden sign freshly carved and painted. "I thought you might want to hang this." Jonas took it, read the words she'd burned into the wood. Cedar Ridge, founded 1855, restored 2023. Below that, in smaller letters, "For Daniel, who stood his ground, and for those who taught me to stand mine, Clara." His voice caught. It's your legacy," she said simply. "Your grandfather's legacy and yours both. You don't have to hide anymore, Jonas. You don't have to be the hermit on the ridge. You can be the man who came home." He set the sign aside carefully and took her hand, the gesture still new enough to make his heart race. "When I first came here, I thought home was a place, a location where you could hide from the world. But you taught me different. Home is people. It's belonging. It's being willing to stand for something that matters." "And what matters to you now?" she asked softly. "You, Thomas, this settlement, the life we're building together." He squeezed her hand. "I'm not the man I was 12 years ago, Clara. I'm not even the man I was 3 months ago. You've helped me become someone I can actually live with. You did that yourself. I just reminded you that you were worth saving." They sat together as the afternoon faded toward evening, watching the snow transform the mountains into something clean and new. Jonas thought about Daniel Cutter, about the letter his grandfather had written to an infant son he'd never see grow up, about courage and legacy and the weight of family history. But mostly he thought about the future, about the conversation he and Clara had been building toward for months now, about commitment and partnership and building something that would last, about the possibility of filling that new room with something more than woodworking tools and Thomas's practice pieces. "Clara," he said, and she turned to look at him, her brown eyes warm and knowing. "That conversation we keep saying we'll have about the future. I'm ready for it," she said. "Whenever you are, I'm ready." And he was, finally completely ready. "I love you. I want to build a life with you, a real life here together." If you'll have a reformed hermit with too much history and not enough sense, she laughed, the sound like water over stones, bright and clear.
I'll have you.
History and all. But Jonas, you have to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll stop calling yourself a hermit. You're a member of this community now. You're a teacher, a friend, a protector. You're the man who brought life back to this mountain. Own that. Be that. Jonas looked at the sign she'd made, at the words that connected past and present, that honored both Daniel's courage and his own hard-won peace. Then he looked at Clara, at the woman who'd seen past his isolation to the man he could become, who'd had the patience to wait while he learned to live again. "I promise," he said, and kissed her as the snow fell soft and silent around them. That night, Jonas hung the new sign at the entrance to his property, replacing the weathered old marker that had been there when he'd arrived 12 years ago. He stepped back to admire it in the lamplight, feeling Clara's presence beside him, warm and solid and real. The wooden cross still hung above his cabin door, grey with weather and time. But next to it now hung Thomas's slate with its careful message, "Thank you for my life." And on the mantel inside, Daniel's pocket watch sat beside Clara's pressed wildflower. Symbols of past and present intertwined. Jonas Cutter had come to these mountains seeking isolation, seeking punishment for failures he couldn't forgive. What he'd found instead was redemption through connection, healing through service, and love through the simple act of choosing to stay when he could have run. Some people said he'd saved Cedar Ridge, but Jonas knew the truth. Cedar Ridge had saved him from a living death of isolation. Saved him from the prison of unforgiving guilt. Saved him by giving him a reason to stand, to fight, to live. As he and Clara walked back to the cabin through the falling snow, Jonas felt a peace he'd thought lost forever. His grandfather's legacy wasn't just about standing against evil. It was about standing for something. For family, for community, for the belief that people could be better than their worst moments, could build something good from the rubble of their mistakes. The mountains stood silent and eternal around them, witnesses to both Daniel's death and Jonas's rebirth. And somewhere in the cold winter wind, Jonas could almost hear his grandfather's voice, approving, proud, at peace. The hermit on the ridge was gone. In his place stood a man who'd finally come home.